I want to start by thinking together about what it is to make an exhibition. For myself, one of the main drivers in making an exhibition and making a book is to learn about something, to learn about the artist and the artwork. I also want the art to learn a little bit as well about our space. I want our space to learn what it is to host art. I want our space to learn from the art and the art to learn from the audience, and everything to be in a situation of asking questions to each other and wondering what it is to be in this particular space at this particular time. I'm fortunate enough, I walk through this space several times a day. Every time I walk through this space, it changes. And I change, and the times change, and that's something I think quite interesting to capture. The book, of course, adds another layer to that. What is it to commission writing about art, writing that asks questions of art, that learns alongside art, that makes room for an audience? And all three texts in this book do that. They make new space alongside the art, and I think there's something very particular and very special about that. The delight in asking Michael to write, obviously, Michael, your range of references, from Wyndham Lewis to Kraftwerk, from A Winter's Tale to Mad Men, you cast your net extraordinarily wide. Your text starts with a question and moves on with questions, and I think Martin will agree with me that asking you to write was part of that. What is it? What is it to ask a writer to get to grips with an artwork? I don't know if I want to, maybe, shall I hand over to you, Martin? You say a little bit about that, about Michael's approach to your work.
Yeah, just very briefly, because, as much as this is about the exhibition, of course the book becomes an important part of that kind of story and that kind of process. So the question is always, when you are lucky enough to be in a situation where we get to make a book, then the question is, who would we ask to write about it? And I kind of had an amazing experience just after lockdown when when we could start traveling again. And I teach in Hamburg at the art school there, and I made one of my very first trips, which was long and drawn out for various reasons, but I was accompanied by Michael's book, Souvenir. And so that hanging around airports, listening to music while I was sort of reading, and it was just this, I got completely lost in this amazing book. And something of the atmosphere and the feel of a place and of time that Michael is able to conjure up is so extraordinary. It's like these sort of peculiar dreamlike moments between the words, almost, if you like, that I felt or hoped that there was maybe some connection that we could make for the book. So by inviting Michael, and so maybe as a way of illustration, I'm going to read, because you get to see my work here, but you don't. Maybe not everyone. We're not with Michael's work in a sense. So there's a little passage that I kind of picked out. There could have been many things, but this is actually from Michael's most recent novel, Unfinished Business. And the main character is on his second half bottle of Chianti, and maybe also a couple of gin and tonics down, and is in a restaurant on his own. So after an hour or so, he was suspended, weightless, in a pause in time that was meaningful and poetic and enabled him to see immense distances. He simply had to stay forever in this stilled, floating moment in which everything was benign and comfortably significant. He felt that he could see modern, dim-lit corridors that led to quiet apartments, deserted street corners after the rain had stopped, empty platforms and wide, sodium orange roads curving out of London off towards the suburbs at night. Somewhere out there, and he could see down the tracks through an orderly, alluring nocturnal world of floodlit yards and vacant lots. Far beyond was his family home, his old room looking out over the heath as the common land that lay beyond Thornby Avenue was known locally. There were the wind-bent trees against the silver blue evening sky. And so there's something of this sort of slightly tipsy reverie that also, as yeah, as an artist, often traveling on your own, eating on your own sometimes in restaurants, I kind of really related to this sort of strange, dislocated sort of, yeah, state that kind of chimed with me. And so, I mean, hopefully you can appreciate the sort of Michael's ability with language, which is sort of extraordinary. And so I feel very fortunate to have you here.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, I think, it's one of the first conversations that Martin and I had actually about doing this publication, which is such a handsome volume, I have to say. It looks fabulous. Is this question about what exactly is a catalogue essay and what is its purpose. I was having lunch about a year ago with a distinguished but shall remain nameless gallery owner from Germany, but a person of some wealth and influence and power, who rather dishearteningly said to me, a writer on art, nobody reads this stuff and nobody cares. It just looks bad if you don't have an essay. Which was, Prussian in its bluntness. But it did also set me thinking that there's so many different ways to write about art. You can come at it from all kinds of ways. What I felt specifically with Martin was that there was something there for me which was to do with beauty, with enigma, with tension, and with situation. And you can shuffle those qualities around and you've got the basis of Hitchcock or David Lynch. You've even got a sort of a musical framework as well. And I suppose I felt that as a generalist, because I have no art background at all, I was a music journalist, is how I came into this stuff. But I wanted almost to go back to the 19th century idea of criticism, which is that you simply respond. Oscar Wilde calls it the impressions of the soul. You respond to what is the feeling of being in the presence of this work, and you try to describe it. And I think that Martin's work, it's almost incantatory, in my opinion. Like, what are these? They have the feeling sometimes of something out of film noir. They have feeling at other times that, are you looking at some kind of side project of assemblage art? There's touches of pop. But you also get the feeling of the workings of an incredible intelligence, a kind of an idea that somebody is sort of threading this narrative together, and it does make absolute sense that there's nothing there simply for the sake of style or cool or image or whatever, that it all interrelates. And it's one of the things Fiona said earlier, is that it's incredible in this exhibition we're sitting in now, how the number of pieces have an incredible dialogue between them. They pick up on one another in all kinds of different ways. And so in trying to write about it, I just tried, I suppose, to, chronicle my experience of looking at these things, which actually is what Matthew Arnold talked about in The Function and Value of Criticism in about 1846. But it's an idea that filters on, as you probably know, through Ruskin and Pater, to people like Oscar Wilde, and almost ends up somewhere in phenomenology with the idea of what happens when you scrutinize something. Somebody once said you could end up writing 500 pages about the taste of a cup of coffee, and that's possibly not a very good idea. But anyway, so that was how I got into it.
I think we could certainly have done an entire book on what it is to wedge a chair under a door,
Yeah.
based on the kinds of conversations that we've all had. And I wonder if we should, in our minds, all of us, go down to the lower gallery and stand in the space, either in the room or on the other side of the door, stand with that door and the chair wedged under its handle, bearing in mind that sort of off to our left there's a photograph of a similar thing. Can I ask you both to talk about what it is to be, what it is to make that work, what it is to look at that work, what it is to be in the space of that?
Yeah, I mean, the starting point for that piece was an invitation in 1999 from a furniture company in London called SCP, and they were inviting a group of artists to make an edition of pieces of furniture and to see what would happen if an artist frame, of a furniture designer. And of course, the commissioners said to everyone, one thing I would suggest is no one try a chair, because all the good chairs have been designed, and it's.
We're going to switch mics. Having just said that the handheld ones are really annoying, we're going to make you have a handheld one. Shall I give Martin this one? Okay, are you sure? Okay.
Is that okay? So of course someone says, don't design a chair. It's like, well, what are you going to do? But I was really interested in this idea as the chair as a piece of hardware, and my references at that point were very much sort of cinematic and sort of tapping into this history of noir cinema and Hitchcock thrillers and so on. So this idea of a chair that could be specially designed to wedge a door closed sort of became an interesting sort of proposition, like what would this chair look like, and so on. So this was the route I went down there. So this small photograph that you can see of the original chair, and then of course flash 20 years or so, I had this kind of strong urge to revisit this work, under this, Trumpian politics and the politics of migration and borders and protectionist ideologies.
I don't know. Can you hear? Are you hearing all right?
Okay. Yeah.
We're just we're paranoid now. It's being with your work. That's what it is.
And it was really driven by another kind of reason, but it really made me want to revisit this work, this idea of what it means to be kind of lodged inside somewhere while other kind of things are going on in the world, and what it means to kind of,
Hang on 1 minute. I think we need to take the headset off. I think it's interfering with itself.
Is that not turned off?
I think it's turned off, but maybe it'll help. The actual microphone, I can see it's flashing red and green. It's not happy. None of it's happy. Try that.
Is that better? Okay.
I think I'm going to give you this one. Should we try that? Will you just bear with us? Because I can see that one dropping in and out. Here we go. Just bear with us a minute. Talk amongst yourselves.
Okay. Better? Yes. And I think throughout the show there are these kind of spaces in between time that crop up. So this, between 1999 and 2022, I think, you have these two doors. being wedged closed for different impulses and different reasons to go about that. You know, in this room we have the vents from 2003, and you know we have a piece from 2022. So again, these 20-year time spans where things are in conversation with each other and sort of seem to slot together and seem to open up. Yeah.
I mean, I suppose that's why I wanted us to talk about Downstairs a bit, because there is, as Michael said, there is this extraordinary conversation between the works. And I think as a curator, you're often thinking a really good work can hold a lot of space. But with this show, I'm beginning to think a really good work can jostle with other work, and it can elbow something out, and it can work alongside something else. And there is something, I think was you were saying in that sense, that Downstairs, these works are talking to each other as well as to us. And I suppose I'm quite interested in, you know, you wrote the text before you saw the show. It's very unfair because you've only just seen the show. Do you have a different view of them? Do these chairs speak in a different way now you've seen them together?
Interestingly, no. Although obviously seeing something for real is slightly different. I mean, one of the things that I kind of am really interested in, and I always have been, and this is going in a slightly different direction, but it's about this extraordinary succession of generations within Scottish art since the mid-1980s who seem to have managed to mine this very, very particular area. I'm sort of going right back to sort of painters like Stephen Campbell, Adrian Wisniewski, create these kind of deeply atmospheric landscapes where there's stuff happening which could be quite spooky or it could be absurd. It's also very learned. It's calling in all kinds of things. And then you have another generation which brings together people like David Shrigley, who are using the environment and absurdity, again, to create these kind of extraordinary ways of looking at the world, using painting or using sculpture or using Douglas Gordon used film. And what they seem to have in common is a sort of almost like a pathologist's or a mortician's understanding of romanticism. There's a profound romanticism at work, and I mean, it maybe even stretches on into, you know, the Lucy Mackenzie generation as well, you know, that she sort of colonizes an idea of European culture and then turns it into a form of self-portraiture. I really wanted to know, do you see yourself very much as shaped by that lineage, or was it not really of any...
Well, I mean, I think...
You just happened to be there at the time?
No, I mean, there's definitely, yeah. I think, you know, when you talk about the figurative painters, you know, they really were just before my generation, and so there's actually, looking back now, there doesn't seem to be such a kind of big age difference or time gap, but at the time they were really from another planet, you know, and the group of artists I went through college with, and that we continue to work together and organize exhibitions together with, you know, we actively kind of worked in opposition to that model.
Really? So
it was only later that we, I think, could really appreciate what some of them had done and were doing. I mean, I remember begrudgingly kind of really thinking the Stephen Campbell show at the Third Eye Centre was pretty good. And I've always had a soft spot for Adrian Wisniewski's work as well. I think, you know, he's an amazing painter. But of course, you know, it's like when if you were in a band, you couldn't like another band because they wore a certain colour of shoe or something like that. You know, it was just they had broke the rules. You know.
I mean, there's a really good theory about young British art that one of the reasons it happened in the way it did was because those artists had to rebel against critical theory. They'd been force-fed cultural theory, and so what you do, you pretend to be a Cockney and go mad. And if you look at those early videos by the YBAs, early Gillian Wearing pieces, early Angus Fairhurst pieces, they're basically people going crazy. So I think that reactive aspect of one generation to the next is always kind of really interesting. Thinking in the case of your work, that there does seem to be this, in my reading of it, was that essentially you're also sort of like a romantic poet taking your revenge on cultural theory. I mean, is that true, do you think? Or?
I mean, not consciously, but yeah, I think it, for me, it really took a while, and it was only through the work itself that I opened myself up to the possibilities of, you know, the romantic or the poetic. It was in 2002 I made this exhibition in Tramway in Glasgow.
Oh, yeah.
Which took the form of this kind of urban park landscape with these fluorescent sapling trees and so on. And also I titled, the show was titled after a line from a New Order song, Our Love is Like the Flowers, the Rain, the Sea, and the Hours. And I remember sitting with the curator, and she kind of said, you know, do you have a title for the show? And I said, yeah. She said, what is it? And I said, I'm going to have to write it down, because if I say it out loud, it sounds ridiculous,
right.
you know? But I knew I wanted to do it. I knew that it was an important part of the makeup of the exhibition. This kind of, these, you know, fluorescent light and chain link fence and painted steel. And I wanted to have this romantic aspect to it in the title, so that you had this kind of tension between this kind of quite abject sort of landscape, but also this, the poetry of that essence.
Yeah. I mean, because Fiona was saying about, if you look at the exhibition downstairs, one of the first things that strikes me, to answer your question, Fiona, is the incredible delicacy of some of the materials you're using, like this kind of the sort of almost gauze-like punched steel sheets that you've then painted in these absolute, I mean, the colours that kind of, you know, Whistler would have loved, you know, I mean, they're sort of and there's a real sort of aesthetic power to them, capital A. I mean, not wanting to overdo it, but I mean, do you think, is beauty something? I remember Bernard Sumner, can I point out, once said that, you know, somebody was interviewing him and talking about Joy Division and how, you know, dark it was and how violent it was, and he said, yes, but we wanted it to be beautiful as well. And I wonder, is beauty something that you're after?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's... Yeah, I think so. I think so, but I think in order for it to function within the practice, you know, I'm constantly, walking this tightrope. So it's maybe why this kind of line between the kind of abject and the beautiful, or something like this, where I kind of allow myself. So maybe this is where, you know, if I want to conjure a kind of cherry blossom, you know, it's going to be done in perforated aluminium, you know, in an industrial material, to somehow kind of work against this indulgence, you know, if you like. So I think there's always this attempt to kind of immerse yourself in it or lean into it, but also pull back from it.
Because I mean, you've spoken about how you sometimes get a bit wearied with the fact that people almost try to solve your work by spotting the kind of, you know, cultural reference points and so on. But are there, I mean, would it be fair to say that there were artists who seemed to show a path for you? I mean, I'm sort of thinking about an artist, for instance, who was incredibly interested in both, you know, design, you know, and sort of formalism and aesthetics, and Richard Hamilton comes to mind, you know, who could weep at the sight of a Braun telephone or whatever. I mean, were there artists who, it's a ghastly thing to ask an artist, but were there artists that you seemed to show you a way ahead, or?
Yeah, I mean...
And you don't have to give away your sources.
Yeah, but, I mean... You know, I remember clearly this being in. I was brought up in Hamilton in Lanarkshire, and you know, going to the Hamilton Library, and I remember the orange spine of this book that said pop art down the side of it. I was maybe 13 or 14. I didn't know what pop art was, but I pulled it off, and I looked through it, and something. I used to take the book back, and they would stamp it out again. I would take it when it was due to go back. I would take it, and they'd stamp it out again. I would take it home. And I got really immersed in that, and it just made sense to me, or it kind of spoke to me in a way. So I became very aware of Warhol and Klaus Oldenburg and Richard Hamilton, and those artists kind of through that. But before I didn't really understand what time frame they were operating in, or how that related to the time I was living in. It felt contemporary and modern before I really knew what those words really meant.
Yeah.
And being at art school was really at this incredible moment, particularly in the US, when the pictures artists and the Neo Geo kind of situation was happening. So, Richard Prince, Chaim Steinbach, Robert Gober, Peter Halley, all these artists were, they'd literally rush into the art school library and, wrestle flash art off the shelf and absorb it all, So they became also very important, and they seem to have this relationship with pop art as well.
Yeah. I mean, sorry, Fiona, we were going to go downstairs. I'm sorry, it's
I'm very happy. You just carry on.
Well,
Very nice.
well, when we were downstairs earlier, one of the things you mentioned, which I found kind of interesting, was that in some ways you see these artworks as having a potential function as props within a situation, or within a mise en scène, or
Yeah, I mean, I think you touch on it in the essay as well. You notice that there are these small black and white text works, and which take the form of addresses or fictional addresses, and then one of the storage unit sculptures, which again take the form of these sort of like modular shelving systems that have been completely sealed. It has the title for 129 Fairview Lane, and this for is kind of important, and it suggests that this object is for, or perhaps from, this place. So it locates, so the sculpture finds itself located within this address, or in proximity to this address. And so that idea of the works or the objects that they relate to, the sculptural equivalents, have a natural habitat, perhaps.
Is it worth at this point asking you about menace and fear? I mean, I think there is this sense of, and we've talked about beauty, and I think it is really very important, and there's an elegance, but there is this undercutting of fear. We talked about Fairview Lane, but can we talk a little bit about that? Or maybe not.
Yeah, I guess I'm trying to, it's that period, and I guess this also relates to that thing of a relationship to beauty, where instinctively you want to lean into something, but you find yourself pulling back or recoiling from it. And I think what happened, when I was doing my MA in Glasgow, I spent one semester in LA at CalArts, and exactly at that moment, there was this sort of new interest in mid-century design, and I became, or a particular re-interest in it. Wallpaper magazine, the first issue came out when I was there, and I had become kind of interested in these objects, these pieces of furniture, and certain furniture designers and architects, but I didn't really know what to do with that information. And as I began to kind of play around with it and see if it could sort of be drawn into my sort of sculptural language, the other thing that I guess I wanted to do was to kind of draw this interest out of its sunny Los Angeles, optimistic, democratic kind of landscape that it entered the world as part of, and kind of drag it into this noir, this parallel noir world. I thought I was doing something to cause
I
this.
think we are doing something. I will keep apologising for the sound. I hope you are hearing some of it. Between the pigeons and the speakers, I think we're slightly embarrassed this evening. But there we go. So with noir, obviously there's film. And there's, I think, a huge sense, and it's one of the reasons that I'm so delighted we have you, Michael. There's a lot of different art forms coming together here. And we talk a lot about film, but I want to also think a little bit about sound. I know we wanted to get there at some point, and I want to go there now because it seems to me that we've talked about poetics, we've talked about sonics. There's something here that isn't necessarily about the visual, or the visual speaks to us in a particularly sonic way. And I don't know enough about pop music, but I know two people who do, and it seems to me there's a conversation to be had there.
What was the phrase that you found? This fantastic phrase.
Sonics of the visual.
Yeah, how would you, I mean, it's a terrible thing again to ask you, but if somebody asked you to, could you relate that phrase to your own work? Say it again, the sonics
of the visual.
The sonics of the visual.
It came up in a podcast I was listening to about sculpture. But I suppose there's something in this piece, for example, that, and I'm going to get the phrase wrong, but you mentioned chimes and sleigh bell beauty is a phrase that you used in the text. And it's like, what is sleigh bell beauty? What does that sort of mean? But I completely understand. I completely felt that sense. And there's something of glass tinkling that I hear when I look at this piece, or strip lights when they used to flicker before they went on. Ding, 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 and there's something of this sound that might be present, and I think it's that kind of thing, rather than necessarily, I mean, we have spoke a little bit about those reference points to, cultural reference points to music and so on, but I think there's something sometimes in the sounds that might fill the silence of the work, something.
I'm just aware that both of you, when you talk about particular things like romanticism, for example, or modernism, there's quite often a sound element to that, as well as a visual element. You talk about slippage, and there is, to me, something about the atmospheres that your work creates that does have you can hear it. You can hear it.
Yeah, I mean, I think, again, probably the Tramway exhibition in 2002 was perhaps the first time that I worked with that, and I mean, I say as if I knew what was going to happen. I put these things together, but really it was the work itself that told me, that I learned from the work, that actually the work seems to have this sense of stillness to it, and I don't know why or where that comes from, but it does. And but that idea of that charging the tone that you can introduce to a room, the atmosphere, that you can walk into a room and you can feel it, you can feel the temperature drop, or you can feel something else, something's going on. There's a sense of that the air between the works is sort of charged, rather than the exhibition being about a series of autonomous objects. Yeah. There's something at play in the room and in the space.
Yeah. I mean, it's funny, I think, going back to that idea of, the sort of, it seems almost unending capacities of romanticism that, I think it's 1817, Keats writes to his brothers and comes up with, in relation to Shakespeare's comedies, he comes up with the notion of negative capability, which is this thing where you simply don't try to explain what you can't understand, you go with it, and you make that, it's almost like resisting, I mean, in modern terms, it's resisting the temptation to try to analyze or in analysing, begin to amend or correct. You simply go with it. And Baudelaire, reprises the idea in 1855 with the idea of strange beauty, where he says that there must be this kind of element of the inexplicable, but equally present. It's a kind of subjective capacity. And I personally, for my own interest, and it's an entirely eccentric thing to do, I just wrote a thing, it's about 8,000 words, about the rehabilitation of beauty as a term in art criticism. And I said, whilst we're about it, why don't we reintroduce the soul? Why don't we reintroduce, notions of spirituality, the entire lexicon, in fact, of late 19th century art critical terms, which would have been laughed out of the room. And yet, it doesn't seem to me that when I talk to artists, they always want to talk about beauty. They always want to talk about strangeness. They always say, well, I can't actually tell you, but, I'm very happy if it... And I felt that, in a strange kind of way, writing about your art, I noticed these ideas were coming along, but it was fabulous for them to come along with your art, because I also felt I recognized, as we've spoken about before, the fact that, you included work in the True Faith exhibition, in Manchester about New Order and Joy Division. And that I suspect that we are fellow travelers in the kind of world of sort of that post-punk kind of aesthetic, which is far more than musical. It's something to do with elegy, and it's something to do with an elegy for modernism. It's also something to do with a fear of the digital. And I just kind of, I get this from what you do, and I'm not ashamed to say it, I find it very emotional. And you were saying somebody else had said that they found the show...
I think particularly in the warehouse, the new space, our new space, I think in some ways you have made a graveyard for your work and for ideas, and there is that sense that you've made them strange. You've injected a new element of strangeness in them by the way you've shown them. And certainly, particularly Spook School is, I think, very, very emotional for people here, but all of the works have that melancholy, particularly in the warehouse, I think, because they have been made strange to each other. I think if we started off in the lower gallery talking about how your works have a conversation with each other, down in the warehouse they're having a backstage conversation. They're strange to each other, and I don't know if they're strange to you.
Well, you definitely, bringing things together in a new configuration, and so there's always surprises when you do that. And it's kind of coincidental, but it's sort of quite nice in relation to the the making of this exhibition. When I received the email invitation from you, I was in the storage unit of the Modern Institute Gallery, which is out by Glasgow Airport. It's this huge warehouse full of crates. But the idea of playing with that kind of space, the sort of backstage or storage facility, or this in between pre and post whatever space was something I'd been thinking about for a while, but never quite had the right opportunity to do it, to try it out. And then, of course, the warehouse was just tailor-made for it. But I think even, you plan these things and you have ideas about how it might work, but it really took me by surprise about just what happened in that space, because the space has this kind of web of iron beams that cut through the space, which are already like a kind of installation of something. But by hanging these net curtains, they disappear. You give them a purpose and they completely disappear and create these rooms that you catch glimpses of things through. But I think, the Spook School piece really that took me by surprise. I've shown it before, always hung of how to, of laying it out on a table, and just the act of laying those images and laying them on these packing blankets, you know, taking that care with them, and whether you're sort of putting them to rest or looking at them as they've just come back from an exhibition or they're about to go out. And of course, the images themselves represent the in-between moment where we could dare dream of the building coming back to life. And of course, when I took the photographs, there was no way of knowing that they would be bookended by these horrific events. And so, and it's at the opening, and then last night, sorry, not last night, earlier this week in London, I met an artist who had come up to see the show, and they described it as moving. Said a very moving exhibition, and it's quite something. And it's difficult to locate where that is, but it might be centered around Spook School.
I think it might be, certainly for those of us up here. But there is, one of the things that, you write your 500 words about an artist, and one of the things that everyone writes, and I've always thought, you make spaces of in-between. We're sitting between and behind. We are sitting in a space of in-between. But this show, it makes that so obvious that it's in between times, as well as in between spaces, in between art forms, in between one iteration of work and another. It's like we're in some incredibly indeterminate place. And that, I think you can't not think about how indeterminate life is and how transient it all. And maybe there's something about that, I don't know, in the moving of it. I hate to say this, but we've got 10 minutes of this left, so I'm going to, if that's okay with you, open it out to questions for a while. And let's see if anyone else's microphone works. Let's see if you guys can make it work. I think, are we going to try for a roving mic so that people online can hear? There's a question right at the front. If you think of your questions, and if Ruth waves to me if there are questions online, and we'll try for a bit of a Q&A. Just go for it and see.
It's not working, is it?
Yes.
Okay. I had two questions about words, one for each of you. I wanted to ask Michael what he really meant, or what he meant by incantatory. I wanted to ask Martin if you played with the word retrospective when you were creating this show.
By the word incantatory, I suppose I meant of the nature of an incantation.
There's a grammar lesson right there.
No, more a kind of a building of effects, a kind of like a brewing or a conjuring.
Like a spell?
Possibly, yes. A spell is a very particular thing, because a spell is normally to do with the exertion of power in a particular kind of way to affect the course of events. So an incantation could be part of it. I think I meant it in a gentler way than spell, more just kind of a conjuring in a sort of in a way that isn't necessarily wholly explicable. Why do you ask? I'm interested.
Because you didn't say any more, and I wondered what...
I think, what did I say? I said that I found the space incantatory, the exhibition downstairs incantatory. Yeah, I think that's, if I was going to be absolutely specific, I suppose I'd say that as you go around looking at the different things and you become attuned to the experience of the materials, of the kind of sometimes, to me anyway, sort of very enigmatic nature, and yet also the elegance of it. It brewed an atmosphere, and so that was why I used that word.
I think if I ever used the word retrospective, it was to say, this is not a retrospective, which of course every artist does. No one will admit to a retrospective because it kind of makes you feel very, very old. But so I always talked about it as, I can't remember how I quite talked about it, but it was definitely about you know, I mean, also the word survey doesn't feel right, but I guess what I allowed myself to do was to use the work itself as sculptural elements, you know, was to play with the works to create new constellations, if you like. I mean, the best example being the warehouse, I think, you know, so it almost becomes a work in itself for this period of time. And then it goes back to being these other things that go to different places and other different warehouses and wherever they go back to, you know. But yeah, retrospective's a really funny one. Yeah, I still feel like we're in the middle of, you know, I'm learning from this, and then you know, the next things happen. So.
There's a lot of code in the book. There's a lot of Martin's code and a lot of Elizabeth's code, and at one point we did slightly worry that we might have killed you off because we put the dates and the dates of the beginning of your career and now and a full stop. I was like, we really can't do that. Can we not do that? But anyway, are there more questions for Martin or Michael? I see the microphone's gone from Michael, so you've had your luck there. Are there any more questions? Are there any questions online? Can't see Ruth. Nope, not online. Any further questions? One in the middle? Two. One in the middle and then one. And one. Can the gentleman put your hand up so Louise can see you, and then we'll come forward. Thank you.
I wanted to know if you were influenced by Antonioni films, because in Blow Up there's a big neon sign, and it's got, and then you focus on the lettering, and the lettering's completely abstract, and you know, it's probably just a surface reading of some of your work I saw in the exhibition, but you know, the sort of numbers on the phone, for instance, you know, don't make any sense, or they don't make any sense to, like, you know, like me. So yeah, no, I just wondered, because I was really intrigued by just these familiar objects that were kind of skewed, or you know, like the sort of plug, you know, sort of holes and things like that. And anyway, that's
Yeah, I did one of the first solo exhibitions I did in Europe, I guess, was in Cologne around 2000, and the gallerist wrote a press release that mentioned my work and its potential relationship to Antonioni, and so I had to go and look up who Antonioni was, because I didn't know, you know. I probably nodded and went, yeah, you nailed it. Yes, yeah, I'm a big fan. And I didn't know. So of course then you, and at that time you couldn't find. Where did you find? How would you watch? You'd have to just watch BBC Two at 11 o'clock at night for like 3 years and hope one appeared or something like that. But then slowly over time, in fact, I remember seeing Eclipse at DCA in the cinema there long after this event. But I mean, I think a room like this, there's something, and I don't even know if it's specifically, but there's something maybe Fellini-esque about it. You know, there's something of this kind of grandeur, or faded grandeur, or this kind of sense of the bourgeois, which those European films of that period sort of really embraced and looked at, and something of this sort of hermetic privilege, or something that I find quite interesting and troubling as well. You know, I find beauty in this, but also on a more critical level. You know, like with the reclining lamp. You know, so you have this grand door from maybe an apartment that might have, you know, molding such as this, and then you have this lamp kind of reclining in a state of reverie. But so there's a kind of beauty to that, and of course it refers to the reclining figure and the dream state. But it also troubles me, you know, this idea of a kind of shut-off privilege from everything else that's happening, you know. So it's those things are kind of, you know, I guess at odds in my mind as well with these works. You know.
I do like because you've said before that there's a lot of things that you put in the work, and it doesn't really matter to you whether they all come out in the mind of the viewer. I quite like the idea that there might also be things that the viewer is putting in, that there are things that aren't coming out, that aren't in there, that we find in there.
That's why we do it. You know, it's that relationship. And it always sounds like a get-out clause. It's like, but it's also this it's the viewer's reception or how they interact with the work. But of course it is. I mean, the viewer makes the work. The viewer makes the meaning. We make, as an artist, you make the work, but the viewer makes the meaning. It brings the meaning out of the work for themselves, and then we share it. And I think the other thing is that, it's this idea of art as a slow release mechanism, is that we're not dealing with entertainment, we're not dealing with social media or media in general. It's another thing, and it can happen really slowly, and it can be, so you can have things buried into the work that might never find themselves released, or ideas or reference points or moments, but they can come out, and word of mouth is one of the ways that they can come out. They can come out in a conversation like this, or in a more private conversation, or that someone, you're looking through a book about something else and you recognize something that might be lurking in that sculpture you saw 2 years ago, And I love that idea that it's not just about standing in front of it, although that's really important, but it's also about that memory and that memory and mismemory and so on.
And that there is why we do what we do, I think. There's one last question there, and then we'll wrap this up. Thank you.
Maybe you all would like to respond to this, if you have anything you want to say, but particularly you, Martin. We've lost so many of our precious resources in the city. Of course, Inverleith House, the Sleeper Gallery. We don't have a film house anymore. And so this is one of the few spaces that shows anything, really, with the exception of artist-run spaces. And being that it's the way it is, and it looks like it's going to be for some time, do you have any kind of ambivalence towards doing a show here, whereas your work was really brought to prominence through Scottish support in the first place? I like to think, and you are celebrating your anniversary here, so happy anniversary to the full staff. But, Mark Francis, who I had the fortune to have some tutelage with back many years ago at NASCAD, he was like a bumblebee that went out perfidiously looking for this and anything he could find and then bringing it back to the capital. And I think that's really why this gallery is quite famous. But it's got to be said, you've been here for now 23 years. 23 years, and I think you're pushing it now, okay? Because you're starting to reheat Scottish art.
Oh, you're talking about me having been here for
At this last
years.
point I am, because
Okay.
we've seen Haley Tompkins recently, we had Carla Black, Jackie Donachie, and it seems like, isn't that surely a point where maybe, 23 years is a long time. When you look at the Quattrocento and look what happened within 23 years, or any period of art. The question is, is it appropriate that anyone should hold a position this long?
Ooh, that's nice on a Friday evening. Thank you.
Good up note to end on.
Exactly. I completely share your admiration for Mark Francis. Goodness me.
You don't need to.
I am going to answer this. And one of the things that he did, as you say so brilliantly, was bring art from elsewhere. And what we do here is we run a program. The next artist to exhibit in the space is Ibrahim Mahama from Ghana. And the artist after him is Barry LeVay, who's no longer with us, but made his work in New York. I'm fairly confident that we're one of the few spaces in Edinburgh running an international program. And thank you for mentioning the spaces that we've lost, because it's a great loss. I do think, however, we are funded for 34% of what we do by the Scottish taxpayer through Creative Scotland, and we have a responsibility to show Scottish artists. We show the finest international Scottish artists. We also show earlier career Scottish artists and artists of promise. And I take your point, and I'll reflect on it, obviously, whether it's time for me to go. But I think there is something about when you've been in a job a long time, you don't repeat yourself. I showed Nathan Coley 23 years ago. Had I moved somewhere, I'd be showing him again. Lots of people do that. I think we've reinvented the space of the fruit market. We've reinvented the program of the fruit market, and I'm quite proud of that. I'll reflect, but I think I'm quite proud of what we do. We have a distributed curatorial authorship. Deep Time, our new music program, is curated by Sam Woods. A large part of our program is curated by Ian Morrison. So, yeah, I take some of your point, but not all of it. I think you addressed the question to all of us, but I'm not sure. I don't know. Do you want to come in on this? Was the question, are you happy to show in the fruit market?
I mean, of course, otherwise you wouldn't do it. One of the things that I was able to do, I mean, I haven't counted it up, but I would say 90% of the work in the exhibition has never been seen in the UK. So for me, it's like, you know, I could complain about how you feel. You know, sometimes as an artist, you feel your own country or your own city is sometimes the hardest place to show. But also, I think a lot of people feel overlooked. You know, in those at home, you know, by the bigger institutions and so on. So. For me, it was an opportunity in a way for me to think about what I've done for the last 25 years, and then share that with my country and my country, you know, the audience that where I still choose to live. I still choose to live in Glasgow. You know, I didn't. You know, we all have lots of escape routes, but you know, we don't always take them. So for me, it's, you know, that's why you do it. That's why I did it. You know.
Well, thank you. I think we are going to wrap it up there. It went to a place I wasn't expecting, but as I say, we do these things to learn stuff, so that's good. As Martin will be signing copies of the book, if you would like to purchase one, we'll whisk him downstairs. And obviously, if you have more questions for Martin or Michael or me, or Penelope or Katrina, will all be around for a wee while. So thank you very much for coming. Thank you for joining us online.